The rain hammered against the library windows like bullets of desperation, each drop carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. Inside the cramped study corner, 17-year-old Karen Robertson pressed her back against the cold brick wall, watching a scene that would shatter everything she thought she knew about kindness, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that bind strangers together. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, sat hunched over a maths worksheet, tears streaming down his cheeks as he erased the same problem for the 4th time. His Superman backpack hung from his chair like a cape that had lost its power, and his sneakers, once white, now grey with wear, swung anxiously above the floor. "I can't do it," the boy whispered, his voice breaking. "Dad's gonna be so mad if I don't understand fractions again." Karen's heart clenched. She'd been homeless for 3 months now, sleeping in doorways and abandoned buildings, surviving on whatever scraps of food she could find. Her own homework lay forgotten in her tattered backpack, college applications that seemed as impossible as reaching the stars. Yet something about this boy's desperation called to her, awakening a part of herself she thought had died the night her mother overdosed and left her with nothing but debt and broken dreams. Without thinking, Karen slid from her hiding spot behind the reference section and approached the boy's table. Her clothes were clean. She made sure of that, using the library's bathroom sink every morning, but worn thin from too many washes and too many nights spent sleeping rough. Her long black hair was pulled back in a ponytail, secured with a rubber band she'd found on the street. "Hey," she said softly, crouching down beside his chair. "Need some help with those fractions?" The boy looked up, his brown eyes wide with surprise and hope. "You know maths?" Karen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. "I used to tutor kids at my old school." "What's your name?" "Tommy." He wiped his nose with his sleeve. "Tommy Rodriguez." "Nice to meet you, Tommy. I'm Karen." She pulled an empty chair closer and sat down, ignoring the way the security guard glanced their way. "Now let's see what's giving you trouble." For the next hour, Karen transformed into someone she barely recognized, patient, encouraging, alive with purpose. She broke down the fractions into pizza slices and chocolate bars, making Tommy giggle as they worked through problems together. She watched his confidence grow with each correct answer and saw the way his shoulders straightened when he finally understood. "You're really smart," Tommy said, as he packed up his backpack. "Are you a teacher?" Karen's throat tightened. "Not exactly. I'm between schools right now. Will you be here tomorrow? I have a spelling test on Friday, and Mom's working late again." Before Karen could answer, the library's closing announcement echoed through the building. Tommy gathered his things, waving goodbye, as he headed toward the exit where other children were being picked up by parents. Karen watched him go, her chest aching with a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. She was packing her own belongings when she saw him, a tall man in an expensive coat, standing by the children's section, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He'd been watching. For how long she didn't know, but something in his expression made her blood run cold. The man had salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that seemed at odds with the calculating way he studied her. He wore a wedding ring and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never known what it meant to sleep hungry. But there was something else in his face, recognition perhaps, or understanding that seemed impossible for a stranger. As Karen hurried toward the back exit, she heard footsteps behind her. The man was following her, his polished shoes clicking against the library's worn linoleum floor. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She'd learned to trust her instincts on the streets, and right now, every instinct screamed danger. She pushed through the emergency exit into the alley behind the library, the cold October air slicing through her thin jacket. The man appeared in the doorway seconds later, but instead of pursuing her into the darkness, he simply stood there, watching as she disappeared into the maze of backstreets that had become her world. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man had recognized something in her gentle interaction with the boy, something that reminded him of a choice he'd made years ago that had saved his own life. And tomorrow, when she returned to help Tommy with his spelling test, that recognition would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything both of them believed about family, sacrifice, and the power of one person to change another's destiny forever. The rain continued to fall as Karen found shelter in the doorway of an abandoned shop. Clutching her backpack against her chest, she closed her eyes and tried to forget the way the man had looked at her, not with pity or disgust, but with something far more unsettling: hope. Do you think Karen should fight for her connection with David or step away to protect his family? Sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one. What would you do if you had to choose between love and sacrifice? Share your thoughts below and let us know where you think this impossible situation should lead. 3 weeks had passed since Karen first accepted Ricardo's dinner invitation, and what began as a single evening of gratitude had evolved into something she'd never dared to hope for: a routine, a place where she belonged. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she helped Tommy with homework at the library, and twice a week, she joined the Rodriguez family for dinner in their sprawling house on the hill overlooking the city. Ricardo had been nothing but respectful, never prying too deeply into her living situation, though Karen caught him watching her sometimes with those penetrating dark eyes that seemed to see too much. She'd crafted a careful story: a college student taking a gap year, living with a family friend while she figured out her next steps. The lies tasted bitter in her mouth, but they kept her safe from questions she couldn't answer. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Ricardo had asked her to come early to help with a surprise for Tommy's 9th birthday party tomorrow. Karen had spent her last $15 on a small gift, a book about space exploration that she'd seen Tommy admiring at the library, and arrived at the Rodriguez mansion just as the sun was setting over the city. The housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, let her in with a warm smile. "Mr. Rodriguez is in his office," she said. "He's been waiting for you." Karen found Ricardo standing before a wall of framed photographs in his home office, his shoulders tense beneath his white dress shirt. The room smelled like leather and expensive cologne, but there was something else, the weight of memories hanging thick in the air. "Karen," he said without turning around, "thank you for coming early. I wanted to talk to you about something before Tommy gets home from his friend's house." She approached cautiously, her survival instincts prickling. In the week she'd been coming here, Ricardo had never asked to speak with her privately. The photographs on the wall came into focus as she drew closer. Family pictures spanning decades, showing Ricardo as a young man, his progression through life marked by achievements, awards, and moments of joy. But it was the picture in the center that made Karen's blood freeze in her veins. A young woman with long black hair and kind eyes stood beside a teenage Ricardo, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The woman looked exactly like Karen, not similar, not reminiscent, but identical. The same heart-shaped face, the same delicate features, the same smile that Karen saw reflected in mirrors. "Her name was Elena Santos," Ricardo said quietly, his voice heavy with old pain. "She would have been your mother's age now, if she'd lived." Karen's legs nearly gave out. Elena, her mother's name had been Elena Robertson, but her maiden name, Santos, Karen whispered, the word falling from her lips like a stone into still water. "My mother's maiden name was Santos." Ricardo turned to face her then, and Karen saw tears glistening in his dark eyes. "I know," he said. "I've known since the first day I saw you helping Tommy. You look exactly like she did when we were 18. The world tilted on its axis. Karen gripped the back of a leather chair to steady herself as Ricardo continued, his voice breaking with each word. "Elena was the love of my life. We grew up in the same neighborhood, planned our whole future together. We were going to get married after high school, start a construction business, have children." He gestured to the photograph with shaking hands. But her parents found out she was pregnant. They were old-fashioned and traditional. They said she'd disgraced the family. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. Pregnant, at 18. They sent her away, Ricardo continued, tears flowing freely now, to live with relatives in another state. I tried to find her, tried to follow, but her father threatened to call the police if I came near their family again. I was just a kid from the barrio, with no money, no connections. I couldn't fight them. The pieces of Karen's life began rearranging themselves, like a puzzle she'd never known she was solving. Her mother's reluctance to talk about Karen's father, the way Elena would sometimes stare at Karen with an expression of profound sadness, the reason they'd moved so often when Karen was little, as if running from something or someone. The baby, Karen whispered. What happened to the baby? Ricardo's face crumpled. I never knew. I spent years trying to find her. Hired private investigators when I finally had money to do so. But Elena had vanished completely, changed her name, disappeared into a life I couldn't reach. He looked at Karen with desperate hope. Until I saw you 3 weeks ago, and I knew she'd had our child, and somehow, impossibly, that child had found her way back to me. The room spun around Karen as the full truth crashed into her consciousness. Ricardo Rodriguez, the wealthy businessman who'd shown her such kindness, who'd welcomed her into his home and his family's life, was her father. The father she'd never known existed, the man her mother had never spoken of, except in the vaguest terms. She's dead, Karen said, her voice hollow. Elena, she died 3 months ago. Ricardo's knees buckled, and he sank into his desk chair, as if the weight of 2 decades of searching had finally crushed him. Dead? The word came out as a broken whisper. Overdose, Karen continued, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, even as her world shattered and reformed around her. She'd been using it for years. I tried to help her get clean, but she shrugged helplessly. Addiction is stronger than love sometimes. They stood in silence for long moments, 2 broken people staring at each other across a chasm of lost time and missed chances. Karen studied Ricardo's face, her father's face, seeing her own features reflected in her. The shape of his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than his right when he was thinking deeply. I'm homeless, Karen said suddenly, the words ripping from her throat like a confession. I've been lying to you for weeks. I don't live with a family friend. I don't go to college. I sleep in doorways and abandoned buildings, and I come to the library every day because it's the only warm place I can stay without being asked for money. I don't have. Ricardo's head snapped up, his eyes wide with horror. Homeless, but your clothes, Yeah? I wash them in gas station bathrooms and sleep in them to keep them from being stolen, Karen said, the truth pouring out of her like blood from a wound. I haven't had a real meal in days, except for what you've given me. I'm surviving on whatever I can find or afford, and I let you believe I was just some college student because I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd stop letting me see Tommy. Ricardo was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room to pull Karen into his arms. She stiffened at first, unused to being touched with genuine affection, but then she melted into the embrace as 20 years of longing crashed over both of them. My daughter, Ricardo whispered against her hair. My little girl, I never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping. Karen sobbed against his chest, breathing in the scent of coffee and expensive cologne and something else, something that felt like coming home after being lost for her entire life. This man, this stranger, who'd shown her kindness when she'd expected nothing, was her father. The parent she'd dreamed of having, the family she'd convinced herself didn't exist. Tommy, she whispered suddenly, pulling back to look at Ricardo through her tears. Tommy is your half-brother. Ricardo finished, his voice full of wonder. He's your family too, Karen. We both are. As if summoned by their conversation, they heard the front door slam and Tommy's voice calling through the house. Dad, I'm home. Is Karen here yet? Karen and Ricardo looked at both, understanding that everything had changed in the space of a single conversation. The girl who'd walked into this office was homeless, alone, surviving on the streets with nothing but her own wits and determination. The young woman standing here now was Ricardo Rodriguez's daughter, Tommy's sister, and an heir to a construction empire worth millions. But more than that, she was loved, wanted, home. What do we tell him? Karen asked, wiping tears from her cheeks. Ricardo smiled through his own tears, the expression transforming his entire face. For the first time since Karen had known him, he looked truly happy. We tell him the truth, that sometimes the universe has a plan bigger than anything we could imagine, and that his homework helper is about to become his sister permanently. As Tommy's footsteps approached the office, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone trying to survive another day, but the deep, abiding hope of someone who finally, impossibly, belonged somewhere. The door opened, and Tommy burst in with his usual enthusiasm, stopping short when he saw their tear-stained faces. "What's wrong?" he asked, his young voice filled with concern. Did something happen? Karen looked at Ricardo, her father, and saw her own overwhelming joy reflected in his dark eye. Everything she'd thought she knew about her life, her family, and her future had been turned upside down in the space of 20 minutes. And for the first time in 3 months of living on the streets, Karen Robertson Rodriguez smiled with genuine, unshakable happiness. What do you think Karen's biggest challenge will be, now that she knows the truth about her father? How do you think Tommy will react to learning Karen is his sister? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most life-changing revelations come when we least expect them. But are they always blessings, or can they bring new complication? 2 months had passed since that miraculous evening, when Karen discovered Ricardo was her father, and what should have been the happiest period of her life had instead become a waking nightmare. The fairy tale reunion had crumbled under the weight of legal complications, family expectations, and secrets that refused to stay buried. Karen sat in the sterile waiting room of Hartwell and Associates, the city's most prestigious family law firm, her hands trembling as she clutched the manila envelope that contained the results of the DNA test Ricardo's lawyers had insisted upon. The test was supposed to prove what they both knew in their hearts, that she was his daughter, that she belonged with him and Tommy, and that her days of sleeping in doorways and scrounging for food were finally over. The test had instead destroyed everything. "Miss Robertson," the receptionist's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Mr. Hartwell will see you now." Karen's legs felt like lead as she walked down the mahogany-paneled hallway. Through the glass walls of the conference room, she could see Ricardo seated at the massive table, his head buried in his hands. Tommy wasn't there. He was at school, blissfully unaware that his world was about to collapse for the second time in his young life. James Hartwell, Ricardo's attorney, was a silver-haired man with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide his professional disappointment. He gestured for Karen to sit across from Ricardo. The DNA results spread between them like evidence at a trial. "I'm sorry, Karen," Hartwell began gently. "The results are definitive. There is no biological relationship between you and Mr. Rodriguez." The words hit Karen like physical blows, even though she'd known they were coming. The phone call 3 days ago had prepared her for this moment, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of Ricardo made it devastatingly real. "I don't understand." Ricardo's voice was raw, broken. He looked up at Karen with eyes full of anguish. "You look exactly like Elena. The resemblance is uncanny. How is this possible?" Karen's throat burnt as she forced herself to speak. "Because Elena Santos wasn't just one person," she whispered. "My mother told me before she died she had a twin sister, Elena Rodriguez, who died in a car accident when they were 19. The color drained from Ricardo's face. "A twin? My mother was Maria Santos," Karen continued, each word feeling like a betrayal of the dream they'd all shared. "Elena's identical twin sister. When Elena died, Maria was so devastated that she sometimes pretended to be her. She took Elena's identification and her social security number. She said it was the only way she could feel close to her sister again. The silence in the room was suffocating. Karen watched as Ricardo processed this information, saw the moment when hope died in his eyes and was replaced by something far worse. The realization that he'd allowed himself to believe in a miracle that never existed. So the woman I loved, Ricardo's voice broke completely, died 20 years ago. Just like you thought, Karen finished. My mother lived her life in Elena's shadow, carrying Elena's grief and guilt along with her own. That's why she could never tell me about my real father, because she didn't know who he was. She'd been using her dead sister's identity for so long that she'd lost herself completely. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Rodriguez, given these circumstances, I have to advise you that continuing any financial support or housing arrangements could create legal complications. Karen is not a minor, and without a biological relationship, get out. Ricardo's voice was barely audible. Sir, get out. Ricardo's roar shook the conference room windows. Both of you, leave me alone. Karen fled the office with tears streaming down her face, but not before she saw Ricardo collapse forward onto the table, his shoulders shaking with grief that went beyond anything she'd ever witnessed. She'd not only lost her father, she'd destroyed a man who'd genuinely loved her mother's memory, who'd built a fantasy around Karen that had given his life meaning again. The next few days blurred together in a haze of desperation and regret. Karen returned to the streets, but now they felt colder and more hostile than before. She'd tasted what it felt like to belong somewhere, to be loved unconditionally, and the loss of it was almost unbearable. She avoided the library, unable to face the place where she'd first met Tommy, where she'd allowed herself to believe in happy endings. Instead, she wandered the city aimlessly, sleeping in different doorways each night, trying to outrun the memory of Tommy's devastated face when Ricardo had finally told him the truth. But she's still my sister, Tommy had pleaded. According to the text message Karen had received from an unknown number, probably Mrs. Martinez, the housekeeper. I don't care about DNA tests. She helped me with my homework. She loves me. The message had been followed by another Mr. Rodriguez is not well. He hasn't eaten in 3 days. Tommy cries every night and asks when Karen is coming home. Please reconsider. But Karen knew there was no coming home from this. She'd seen the look in Ricardo's eyes when the truth came out. Not just disappointment, but betrayal. He'd opened his heart and his home to her based on a lie. And even though she hadn't known it was a lie at the time, the damage was irreversible. On her 5th night back on the streets, Karen found herself outside the Rodriguez mansion, drawn by a desperate need to see Tommy one last time. The house was dark, except for a single light in Ricardo's office window. She crept closer, hiding behind the massive oak tree in the front yard. Through the window, she could see Ricardo sitting at his desk, staring at the photograph of Elena, the real Elena, his lost love. Empty bottles surrounded him, and Karen realized with growing horror that he was drinking himself into oblivion, drowning in grief that she had unknowingly reopened. A movement at the upstairs window caught her attention. Tommy's small face appeared at his bedroom window, looking out into the darkness. Even from this distance, Karen could see that he'd been crying. Her heart shattered as she watched him press his palm against the glass, as if he could somehow call her home through sheer force of will. This was her fault, all of it. She'd inserted herself into their lives, allowed them to love her, and let them build dreams around her that could never come true. Ricardo was destroying himself with alcohol and grief, and Tommy was losing another person he'd come to depend on, all because Karen had been selfish enough to accept their kindness when she should have walked away. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, and Karen recognized Dr. Patricia Henley, the family physician she'd met. during her brief time living in the Rodriguez house. The doctor's expression was grim as she hurried toward the front door, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. Karen knew she should leave, should disappear into the night and never return. But as she watched Dr. Henley disappear into the house, as she saw Tommy's anxious face appear at the window again, she realized that running away wouldn't solve anything. The damage was done, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to help them heal from it, even if it meant sacrificing any chance she had of ever being part of their family again. The rain began to fall as Karen made her decision, each drop feeling like a small funeral for the life she'd almost had. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she'd memorized, but never thought she'd use. Child Protective Services. I need to report a situation involving a minor who may be in emotional distress. As she gave Tommy's name and address to the social worker, Karen felt her heart breaking into pieces so small they could never be reassembled. But sometimes she realized love meant walking away. Sometimes it meant destroying your own happiness to protect the people who mattered most. And sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was the chance to heal without you. Can Karen find a way to help Ricardo and Tommy heal from this devastating revelation without destroying herself in the process? Do you think she's making the right choice by walking away, or should she fight for the family connection they all felt was real? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most painful decisions are made out of love, but are they always the right ones? 2 months had passed since the revelation that changed everything, but Karen Robertson Rodriguez felt more lost than she had when she was sleeping in doorways. The beautiful bedroom in the Rodriguez mansion, her bedroom now, with its cream-colored walls and window seat overlooking the garden, felt like a gilded cage. Every morning, she woke up in Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than she used to spend on food in a week, and every morning, the guilt threatened to suffocate her. The local news had picked up the story. Construction magnate reunites with long-lost daughter. The headlines made it sound like a fairy tale, but fairy tales didn't capture the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that pressed down on Karen's chest every time she sat down to another perfectly prepared meal. Why her? Why did she get saved when thousands of other homeless teens were still out there, still hungry, still afraid? The worst part was how easily Tommy had accepted her as his sister. His joy had been pure and immediate. "I always wanted a sister," he'd exclaimed, throwing his arms around her the night they told him the truth. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she was an imposter in his life, in Ricardo's life, in this house that felt like a museum of everything she'd never had. "You're pushing us away," Ricardo said quietly as Karen picked at her breakfast, staring out the dining room window at the manicured lawn where sprinklers created perfect arcs of water that would never go to waste. "I'm not, you are." His voice was gentle but firm. "You barely speak at dinner anymore. You haven't come to family game night in 3 weeks. Tommy asked me last night if you don't like being his sister." The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She looked across the table at her father. God, it still felt surreal to think that word, and saw the same patient concern he'd shown her from the beginning. But now there was something else. Fear. Fear that she would disappear again, the way her mother had 20 years ago. "It's not that simple," Karen whispered. "Then explain it to me." Ricardo leaned forward, his coffee growing cold as he focused entirely on her. "Help me understand what's happening in your head, Miha." The endearment, little daughter, made her throat tighten. "You want to know what's in my head? Guilt. So much guilt, I can barely breathe sometimes." The words poured out like water through a broken dam. "Do you know what I was doing while you were building your empire and raising Tommy in this beautiful house? I was holding my mother's hair back while she threw up blood. I was stealing food from gas stations because she'd spent our rent money on drugs. I was sleeping in a car that got repossessed when I was 16, and then in shelters that kicked me out the moment I turned 18. Ricardo's face crumpled, but Karen wasn't finished. And the whole time I had a father who could have helped, who the storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 months after Karen had first helped Tommy with his homework in the library. But this wasn't the gentle rain that had brought them together. This was a hurricane that threatened to tear apart everything they'd built as a family. Karen stood in the marble foyer of the Rodriguez mansion, her hands shaking as she clutched the manila envelope that had arrived that morning. Inside were legal documents that could destroy Ricardo's reputation, his business, and most devastatingly, his custody of Tommy. Her stepmother's family, the Morettis, had finally made their move. "Dad!" Tommy's voice echoed from the kitchen, where he was supposed to be doing homework. "Karen, come quickly! There's something on the news." Ricardo emerged from his office, his face grim. He'd been on conference calls all day with lawyers, trying to find a way to fight what seemed like an impossible battle. The Morettis had money, connections, and a vendetta that had simmered for 2 years since Carmen's death. They found Tommy standing transfixed before the large screen in the family room, his small face pale with confusion. The local news anchor's voice filled the room with words that felt like physical blows. Allegations of fraud and improper business practices against Rodriguez Construction have surfaced, along with questions about Ricardo Rodriguez's fitness as a guardian. Sources close to the Moretti family claim that Rodriguez has been hiding assets and engaging in relationships that put his minor son at risk. Karen's photograph flashed on screen, the one from her high school yearbook, the one where she looked young and vulnerable. The reporter continued, "The girl in question, identified as Karen Robertson, has been living in the Rodriguez home despite having no legal guardian and a history of homelessness. Child Protective Services has launched an investigation." "Turn it off," Ricardo said sharply, but Tommy was already reaching for the remote with trembling fingers. "Why are they saying mean things about Karen?" Tommy's voice broke. "She's my sister. She belongs here." Karen knelt beside him, her heart shattering as she saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear she'd carried for months on the streets, the terror of losing the only family you had left. "Sometimes people say things that aren't true, Tommy," she said gently, "but that doesn't make them real. Are you going to leave?" The question came out as a whisper, and Karen saw her own deepest fear reflected in her little brother's face. Before she could answer, the doorbell rang with sharp, official insistence. Through the tall windows, Karen could see 2 black cars in the circular driveway and several people in suits approaching the front door. Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway, her usual calm composure cracked with worry. "There are people here from Child Protective Services and others." Ricardo's jaw tightened, but he straightened his shoulders like a man preparing for battle. "Let them in, Mrs. Martinez." "Tommy, Karen, stay here with me. Whatever happens, we face it together, as a family." The next few minutes passed in a blur of introductions, badges and legal terminology that felt like weapons being drawn in their living room. The CPS worker, Ms. Henderson, was professional but cold. The Moretti family lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit named Davidson, practically radiated smugness. But it was the woman who entered last who made Karen's blood run cold. Victoria Moretti, Carmen's sister, wore her grief like armor and her hatred for Ricardo like a crown. She'd never forgiven him for replacing her sister so quickly and never accepted that Karen had earned her place in this family through love rather than blood, though she didn't know about their actual relationship. "Mrs. Moretti," Ricardo said with forced politeness, "I wasn't expecting you." "Of course you weren't." Victoria's voice dripped with venom. "You thought you could just install some homeless girl in Carmen's place, in her home around her son, and no one would notice." That homeless girl, Karen said, stepping forward with a courage that surprised everyone in the room, is Tommy's sister. And this is her home too. Victoria's laugh was as sharp as breaking glass. Sister, is that what he's calling it now? How convenient. Ms. Robertson, the CPS worker, interrupted, consulting her tablet. We need to discuss your living situation. Our records show no legal guardianship arrangements, no enrolled school attendance, and no concerning reports about your background. Karen felt the familiar panic rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd had on the streets when police officers would approach, when social workers would ask questions she couldn't answer. But then she felt Ricardo's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, and Tommy slipped his small hand into hers. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a family worth fighting for. You want to talk about my background? Karen said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Fine. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in doorways and washing my clothes in gas station bathrooms. I was 18, alone, and surviving on whatever scraps I could find. But you know what? I never stole anything. I never hurt anyone. I never gave up. She turned to face Victoria Moretti directly, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. You want to know why I'm here? Because I was helping a little boy with his homework in the library. A little boy who was crying because he couldn't understand fractions and was afraid his dad would be disappointed. I helped him because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted anything in return. And look how well that worked out for you. Victoria sneered. Homeless girl lands herself a millionaire. Quite the coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. The words exploded from Karen before she could stop them. She looked at Ricardo, seeing the barely perceptible nod that gave her permission to reveal their deepest truth. Ricardo Rodriguez is my biological father. Tommy isn't just the little boy I helped with homework. He's my brother. This isn't some scheme or manipulation. This is a family that found each other after 20 years of separation. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face went white. The CPS workers' stylus stopped moving across her tablet, and even the lawyer seemed momentarily speechless. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. Ricardo stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. Karen is Elena Santos' daughter. Elena and I were together 20 years ago, before her parents separated us. Karen's mother died 3 months ago, leaving her with nothing. When she walked into that library and helped Tommy, she wasn't looking for anything except to help a child who reminded her of herself. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photo of the DNA test results they'd gotten the week before. Official, legal, undeniable proof of their relationship. She's my daughter, Victoria. Carmen knew about Elena and knew that if I ever found my first love's child, they would be welcomed into our family with open arms. Carmen would have loved Karen like her own. Tommy, who'd been listening with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up with the clarity that only children possess. Karen's my sister, and she makes Dad smile again. Why would anyone want to take her away? The CPS worker looked up from her tablet, her expression softening slightly. Mr. Rodriguez, if what you're saying is true, and you have documentation to prove paternity, that does change the legal landscape considerably. It's all here, Ricardo said, producing a folder thick with documents. DNA results, birth certificate amendments, and emergency guardianship papers we filed last week. Karen is legally my daughter, and Tommy's legal guardian in the event anything happens to me. Victoria's facade finally cracked. Carmen should be here, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. My sister should be here raising her son, not some girl who looks like she stepped out of the gutter. Karen felt the familiar sting of judgment, but instead of shrinking away, she stepped closer to Victoria, her voice gentle but firm. You're right, Carmen should be here. Tommy tells me about her every day, how she made the best pancakes, how she sang off-key in the car, how she read him 3 stories every night before bed. I'm not trying to replace her. No one could. But Tommy needs family who are alive, who can love him and protect him and help him grow up into the amazing person he's becoming. She paused, seeing the raw grief in Victoria's eyes. I lost my mother 3 months ago. I know what it feels like to have this hole in your chest that never stops aching. But I also know that Carmen would want Tommy to be happy, to be loved, to have a sister who would do anything to protect him, even if that sister isn't who anyone expected her to be. Victoria collapsed into Carmen's favorite chair, sobbing with the force of 2 years of suppressed grief. The fight went out of the room like air from a punctured balloon, leaving only the truth hanging in the space between them. The CPS worker closed her tablet with a decisive snap. Mr. Rodriguez, based on the documentation and what I've observed here today, I see a stable, loving family unit. Ms. Robertson is clearly being provided for and cared for appropriately. I'll need to file a report, but I don't anticipate any further intervention being necessary. The lawyer, Davidson, was already backing toward the door, mumbling about new developments and reassessing the situation. The investigation that had threatened to tear their family apart crumbled under the weight of the simple truth. Karen belonged here, not because she'd manipulated her way in, but because she'd found her way home. As the officials left and Victoria was escorted out by Mrs. Martinez, who promised to make her a cup of tea and let her grieve properly, Karen sank onto the couch beside Tommy, emotionally exhausted but victorious. "We did it," Tommy said quietly. "We stayed together." "Yeah," Karen said, pulling him close. "We did." Ricardo sat down beside them, wrapping them both in his arms. "I'm proud of both of you," he said. "Karen, the way you stood up for our family, for the truth, your mother would have been so proud." For the first time in months, Karen felt the deep, unshakable peace of someone who had fought for their place in the world and won. She had faced down bureaucrats and lawyers and bitter relatives, had stood her ground when everything she cared about was threatened, and had emerged not just victorious but stronger. Outside, the storm was finally passing, leaving behind the clean, washed scent of new beginnings. Karen looked around at the family room, her family room, where Tommy's homework was scattered across the coffee table, and Ricardo's reading glasses sat forgotten on the side table, and felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The girl who'd once helped a crying boy with his fractions had become a young woman willing to fight the world to protect her family. And in that transformation, she'd found not just a home, but herself. What do you think was the most powerful moment in Karen's fight to keep her family together? Sometimes our greatest strength comes from defending what we love most. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to stand up for what matters most to you, even when it felt impossible? 6 months later, Karen stood in the doorway of what had once been Ricardo's home office and was now her own study space, watching snowflakes drift past the window like gentle promises of new beginnings. The wall of photographs had been expanded to include new memories: Tommy's birthday party, where he'd learned Karen was his sister; her high school graduation ceremony that Ricardo had moved heaven and earth to make happen, and dozens of candid family moments that captured the joy of finding each other after 20 years of separation. But it was the newest addition that made her heart swell with pride: her acceptance letter to Columbia University, framed beside a photograph of her, Ricardo, and Tommy at the construction site, where they'd broken ground on the Elena Santos Memorial Youth Center, a place for homeless teenagers to find safety, support, and educational opportunities. Ready for the big day? Ricardo's voice came from behind her, warm with the affection that had transformed both their lives. Karen turned to find her father. The word still felt like a miracle on her tongue, standing in the doorway wearing his best suit. At 52, Ricardo Rodriguez had found a lightness in his step that had been missing for decades. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened into something more peaceful, and he smiled more easily now, especially when Tommy made one of his terrible jokes, or when Karen shared her dreams for the future. "I've been ready for months," Karen said, smoothing down her navy blue dress, "though I never imagined I'd be giving a speech at the Rodriguez Construction Annual Gala." "You're not just giving a speech," Ricardo corrected, crossing the room to adjust her necklace, a simple gold chain that had belonged to Elena, which he'd kept all these years in hope of someday giving it to his daughter. "You're telling your story, our story, and introducing the foundation that's going to change lives." The Karen Robertson Rodriguez Foundation for Homeless Youth had been Karen's idea, but Ricardo had embraced it with the passion of a man who understood what it meant to lose family and the fierce determination to prevent other young people from suffering as Karen had. In 6 months they'd raised $2 million and were already planning their second shelter facility. "Is Tommy ready?" Karen asked, checking her reflection in the window. "He's been practicing his introduction speech all week." Ricardo laughed. Mrs. Martinez had to stop him from reciting it during dinner last night. Tommy had adapted to having a sister with the resilience that seemed to define the Rodriguez family. At 9 years old, he'd become Karen's fiercest protector and biggest cheerleader, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his sister was the smartest person in the world, and also really good at making pancakes. The transformation in Karen herself was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The hollow-eyed, desperate girl who'd once slept in doorways had blossomed into a confident young woman with purpose and direction. College was just 4 months away, but she'd deferred for a year to help launch the foundation and spend more time with the family she'd never expected to have. "Karen?" Ricardo's voice had grown serious. "Before we go, there's something I want to give you." He pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, and Karen's breath caught. But when he opened it, instead of jewelry, she found a key, old and tarnished, but clearly precious. "This was the key to the first apartment your mother and I ever looked at together," Ricardo explained, his eyes distant with memory. "We were 18, so in love, so sure we could conquer the world. I kept it all these years as a reminder of what I'd lost." He took Karen's hand and pressed the key into her palm. "But now I want you to have it as a reminder of what we found, that love doesn't disappear, even when people do. It just waits, sometimes for 20 years, for the right moment to come home." Karen's eyes filled with tears as she closed her fingers around the key. "Dad," she whispered, the word that had become her favorite in the English language, "I love you too." They held each other in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking of Elena and the impossible journey that had brought them together. Karen had grieved her mother's death properly now, with Ricardo's help and the support of a therapist who specialized in trauma and addiction. She'd learnt that loving someone didn't mean taking responsibility for their choices, and that Elena's struggles with drugs didn't diminish the love she'd felt for her daughter. "Come on," Ricardo said finally, offering Karen his arm. "Your public awaits." They found Tommy in the living room, looking sharp in his miniature tuxedo and practicing his speech one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared to an audience of houseplants, "please welcome my sister Karen, who is definitely not nervous, even though she keeps checking her hair in every mirror." "I do not," Karen protested, laughing. "You totally do," Tommy grinned, then grew more serious. "But it's okay. You're going to be great. You always are." The Rodriguez Construction Annual Gala was held in the ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, with 300 guests who represented the pinnacle of the business and social community. Karen had attended several of these events over the past months, gradually learning to navigate the world of wealth and influence that was now part of her birthright. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't just Ricardo Rodriguez's newly discovered daughter. Tonight she was Karen Robertson Rodriguez, founder and president of a foundation that had already helped 43 homeless teenagers find housing, education, and hope. As Tommy introduced her to thunderous applause, Karen took the stage with the confidence of someone who'd survived the streets and discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The speech she'd prepared focused on statistics and funding goals, but as she looked out at the crowd, she found herself speaking from the heart instead. 6 months ago, she began, her voice clear and strong. I was sleeping in doorways and washing my clothes in gas station bathrooms. I was convinced that I was invisible, that my life didn't matter to anyone. I survived by helping others, tutoring a little boy with his homework, because seeing him succeed gave me a reason to keep going. She found Tommy in the audience, beaming with pride, and Ricardo, who was openly weeping with joy. What I didn't know was that sometimes the act of helping someone else creates a bridge back to yourself. That little boy was my brother. The father who'd been searching for me for 20 years was sitting in that library, watching me discover that I wasn't invisible after all. I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The applause was deafening, but Karen continued, her voice stronger now. The Karen Rodriguez Foundation exists because we believe every young person deserves the chance to discover their own bridge home. We believe that with support, with education, with love and opportunity, there's no limit to what's possible. As she concluded her speech and the crowd rose to their feet, Karen felt a presence beside her that seemed impossible but absolutely real. For just a moment, she could swear she smelled her mother's perfume and could feel Elena's hand on her shoulder, proud and peaceful at last. The foundation raised $3.2 million that night, enough to fund 3 more facilities and a scholarship program for homeless youth pursuing higher education. But for Karen, the real victory was simpler and more profound. She'd found her way home, and now she was helping others find theirs. Later, after the last guest had left and the speeches were over, Karen, Ricardo and Tommy sat in their living room, still in their formal wear but with shoes kicked off and ties loosened, sharing leftover cake and stories about the evening. Mom would have loved tonight, Tommy said quietly, referring to his birth mother. She always said the best families aren't just the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose. She was right, Ricardo agreed, pulling both his children closer on the couch. We chose each other, all of us, and that makes us unbreakable. Karen closed her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of belonging, not just to this family, but to herself. She was no longer a homeless girl surviving on the margins of society. She was Karen Rodriguez, daughter, sister, student, advocate, and living proof that sometimes the most broken things, when they find their missing pieces, become more beautiful than they ever were before. In her pocket, Elena's key pressed warm against her hand, a reminder that love, once planted, never truly dies. It just waits for the right season to bloom again. What aspect of Karen's transformation inspires you most? Her resilience on the streets, her courage to accept love from her newfound family, or her dedication to helping other homeless youth? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most powerful changes come when we turn our pain into purpose and our struggles into strength for others.
Thank you for joining us and watching this story unfold all the way to the end. The fact that you stayed with us means the world. And if you found yourself captivated by every twist and turn of this tale, then I can promise you, with absolute certainty, that you are going to be completely obsessed with what comes next. It's a story even crazier and more gut-wrenching than you can ever imagine. So don't hesitate. Click on the image showing on your screen right now and dive into your next addiction.